My daughter sat at the reading of the will with a smug smile, convinced that I would get nothing from her father's $34 million inheritance. But when the lawyer read one single sentence, everything changed. The smile disappeared from Monique's face, and she started screaming so loudly that the walls of the office shook. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you are listening in the comments. The coffee cup slipped from my fingers, shattering against the linoleum floor as Mr. Patterson's voice rose through the thin apartment wall. "Your damn wind chimes are keeping me up all night again, Shirley." I grabbed a dish towel, kneeling among the ceramic shards. 65 years old and still cleaning up messes that weren't entirely my fault. The decorative wind chimes I'd hung on my balcony last month had one loose hook that sent them clanging against the railing every time the wind picked up. I tried explaining the repair schedule to my neighbor, but patience wasn't Harold Patterson's strong suit. The phone rang. I ignored it, focused on sopping up the spreading coffee puddle. The machine would catch it, but the ringing persisted, cutting through Harold's continued shouting from next door. Something about property values and inconsiderate tenants. On the fifth ring, I stood up, tossing the soaked towel into the sink. "Shirley Coleman speaking." "Mrs. Coleman. This is James Morrison from Morrison & Associates in Atlanta." The man's voice carried that careful, professional tone I had learned to recognize over the years, the kind that preceded bad news. "I'm calling regarding Raymond Marcus Coleman." My hand tightened around the receiver. Nobody had called Raymond by his full name in my presence for 15 years. "What about him?" "Ma'am, I'm very sorry to inform you that Mr. Coleman passed away on Tuesday evening. The funeral service is scheduled for this Friday at 2 o'clock at Peaceful Rest Memorial Chapel." The words hit like a physical blow. I sank into the kitchen chair, its familiar creak suddenly too loud in the silence that followed. Tuesday evening. That was 3 days ago. 3 days while I'd been worrying about wind chimes and coffee stains. "Mrs. Coleman, are you there?" Yes, I'm here." My voice sounded strange, distant. "How did you get my number?" "Your name was listed in Mr. Coleman's personal effects as an emergency contact. I understand you were previously married." "Previously married. 22 years reduced to a legal footnote." "Yes. We divorced in 2010. The words came automatically. Muscle memory from various forms and applications over the years. "I see. Well, there will be a reading of the will following the service. You're named as a beneficiary, so your presence would be appreciated." Beneficiary? The word felt foreign, impossible. Raymond had built his empire after our divorce, transforming the small consulting business he'd started during our marriage into something I barely recognized from the newspaper articles. What could he possibly have left me? "Mrs. Coleman, will you be attending?" Through the kitchen window, I could see Harold Patterson examining his lawn, hands on his hips in that stance that meant another confrontation was brewing. But his complaints seemed to come from another world now, muffled and insignificant. "The chapel," I said slowly. "Which one did you say?" "Peaceful Rest Memorial on Cascade Avenue. The service begins at 2 o'clock, followed by a brief reception. The will reading is scheduled for 4:30 in our offices downtown." I found myself nodding, though he couldn't see me. "I'll be there." After hanging up, I remained in the chair, staring at the phone as if it might ring again and deliver different news. The coffee stains on the floor had already begun to set, dark rings that would need scrubbing, but I couldn't move. Couldn't process the simple fact that Raymond, vibrant, stubborn, impossible Raymond, was gone. The afternoon light slanted through the kitchen window, illuminating dust motes that danced like memories I'd tried so hard to forget. As I sat there, the name Raymond Marcus Coleman echoed in my mind, each syllable pulling me backward through time until I was standing in Ruby's diner on a snowy February evening in 1987, watching a man in a navy wool coat argue with the manager about his hiring practices. "You're telling me you won't consider applicants from the South Side because they can't be trusted? That's the most ridiculous thing I've heard all week." His voice carried across the nearly empty restaurant, clear and uncompromising. I'd stopped mid-bite of my sweet potato pie, fork suspended halfway to my mouth. The man had turned slightly, and I could see his profile. Strong jawline, determined expression, close-cropped hair that caught the fluorescent light. He was magnificent in his righteous anger, and I found myself hoping the manager would keep arguing just so I could listen to him tear his logic apart. "Sir, I didn't mean any offense." "Of course you didn't mean offense. You just meant to discriminate." He pulled a business card from his wallet, sliding it across the counter. "When you change your mind about hiring based on qualifications rather than zip codes, call me." The door chimes jingled as he left, and the diner felt smaller somehow, drained of electricity. I watched through the window as he climbed into a black Buick Regal, noting how he checked his mirrors twice before pulling into traffic. Careful, methodical, but not afraid to fight for what was right. "That one's trouble," the manager muttered loud enough for the whole place to hear. I stood up, leaving a $5 bill next to my half-eaten pie. "No," I said, surprising myself with my certainty. "That one's extraordinary." The business card lay abandoned on the counter. Raymond Coleman, business consultant. I memorized the phone number before stepping into the February wind. It took me 3 days to work up the courage to call. When I finally did, he answered on the second ring with a brisk, "Raymond Coleman. This is Shirley Davis. We haven't met, but I saw you at Ruby's Diner on Friday night." A pause. The woman with the sweet potato pie who told the manager I was extraordinary. "You heard that. I was getting my gloves from my purse. You left without your business card, too." I could hear the smile in his voice. "So, Shirley Davis, what can I do for you?" "Have dinner with me somewhere better than Ruby's?" Another pause. Longer this time. "Are you asking me on a date, or do you need business consulting?" "Definitely a date. Though if you have any advice about convincing handsome men to have dinner with strangers, I could use the consultation." He laughed, a real laugh, not the polite sound men sometimes made when women tried to be forward. "Saturday night, Antoine's on Peachtree, 7 o'clock. He wore a charcoal gray suit to dinner, perfectly tailored, but his smile was warm and genuine. We talked for 3 hours about everything except business. His childhood in Alabama, my job at the hospital, our shared love of old movies and newer books. When he laughed at my story about accidentally flooding my apartment while trying to fix a leaky faucet, I knew I was falling. 6 months later, he proposed in that same diner, sliding a ring across the same counter where his business card had been left behind. "Marry me, Shirley Davis. Make me the luckiest man in Georgia." I said yes before he'd finished asking. Our wedding day blazed with September sunshine, the kind of perfect weather that makes promises feel possible. I wore my grandmother's dress, altered to fit my frame, and carried wildflowers we'd picked that morning. My hands shook as he slipped the ring onto my finger. "Forever," he whispered, and I believed him completely. Monique arrived 2 years later, a squalling, beautiful miracle who transformed our quiet house into something alive with purpose. I remember standing in the hospital room, watching Raymond cradle our daughter with the same fierce determination he brought to everything else, and thinking that this perfect moment, was all I'd ever need. But even then, holding that perfect baby, I noticed how Raymond's eyes occasionally drifted to the business magazine someone had left on the nightstand. As Monique grew from toddler to schoolgirl, I began to notice things I'd missed in those first blissful years. When she turned 7, Raymond bought her a computer. Not a toy, but a real machine worth more than my monthly salary. "She needs to understand technology," he explained, watching her navigate programs I'd never heard of. "The future belongs to kids who think digitally." I'd suggested teaching her to cook my grandmother's recipes instead. He'd laughed, but not kindly. We'd moved by then to Oak Ridge Drive, a house with 3 bathrooms and a kitchen island bigger than our old apartment. Raymond's consulting firm had landed a contract with a telecommunications company, and suddenly we had money for things I'd never imagined needing. A housekeeper came twice a week. Our refrigerator dispensed ice through the door. Monique's bedroom looked like a toy store. "Isn't this wonderful?" Raymond asked one evening, gesturing at our new dining room with its crystal chandelier and table that seated 12. We can finally entertain properly. I missed our old kitchen table, scarred from years of Monique's art projects and our late-night conversations. This new table reflected light like a mirror, showing every fingerprint, demanding coasters and placemats. The entertaining started almost immediately. Business associates, potential clients, other successful couples whose conversations revolved around market share and investment strategies. I'd wear my best dress and try to contribute, but discussions about hedge funds and corporate restructuring left me feeling like I was speaking a foreign language badly. "Shirley works at the hospital," Raymond would explain when someone asked. And I heard something new in his voice, not pride, but an apologetic edge, as if my job required an excuse. Monique thrived in this new world. At 10, she could discuss computer programming with Raymond's tech-savvy clients. At 12, she was critiquing the wine choices at restaurants I couldn't afford on my own. At 14, she rolled her eyes when I suggested family trips to visit my relatives in the country, preferring Raymond's business conferences in New York and Miami. "Mama doesn't understand," became her favorite phrase, usually delivered with the exasperated sigh of someone far too sophisticated for mundane concerns. The first real fight came on Monique's 15th birthday. Raymond had planned a party that looked more like a corporate networking event. Catered food, hired entertainment, guest list full of business contacts and their children. I'd wanted something simpler. Maybe a cookout in our backyard with her school friends. "This is embarrassing," I told him the night before, watching servers arrange elaborate flower arrangements. "She's 15, not 50. She's growing up in a different world than we did, Shirley." He adjusted a centerpiece with the same precision he brought to contract negotiations. "These connections matter. These relationships will shape her future. What about just being a kid?" He turned to face me fully, and for a moment I saw something cold in his eyes. Calculation where there used to be warmth. Being just a kid is a luxury we can't afford to give her. The world is competitive. Either we prepare her to win, or we prepare her to lose. I thought about my own 15th birthday, fishing with my father, a homemade cake, presents wrapped in newspaper comics. It had been perfect in its simplicity. The party was a success by Raymond's standards. Monique charmed the adults, connected with their children, received gifts that spoke of serious money. Laptop computers, designer clothes, jewelry worth more than some cars. But I caught her once, standing alone by the pool, looking lost among all the sophisticated celebration. "You okay, baby?" I asked. She straightened quickly, slipping back into the persona Raymond had helped her craft. Of course. Why wouldn't I be? But for just a moment, I'd seen the confused little girl underneath all that premature sophistication, and it broke my heart. That party marked the beginning of the end, though I didn't recognize it then. What followed were 10 years of slow-motion disaster, like watching a landslide from the bottom of the mountain. Inevitable, destructive, and impossible to stop. Raymond's business consumed more of his time, more of his attention, more of his soul. Weekend family dinners became conference calls. Vacation plans got cancelled for client emergencies. Monique's school events competed with board meetings, and the meetings always won. "You don't understand the pressure I'm under," he'd say when I complained about missing another of Monique's dance recitals. "This business supports our lifestyle. Someone has to make the hard choices." But I understood pressure, the kind that came from working 12-hour shifts at the hospital, from making sure patients got the care they needed when they were at their most vulnerable. The difference was, my pressure served something larger than myself. By the time Monique graduated high school, she'd become a stranger to me. Raymond had groomed her into his perfect protégé. Sharp, ambitious, dismissive of anything that didn't advance her prospects. When I suggested she consider nursing school along with her business applications, she looked at me like I'd suggested she become a medieval serf. "Mama, that's exactly the kind of thinking that's holding you back," she said, 17 years old and already talking like a CEO. "You settled for mediocrity. I won't make that mistake." The words hit like physical blows. Settled for mediocrity. As if 25 years of caring for the sick meant nothing. As if being a steady, present mother was somehow shameful. College made everything worse. Monique chose business school, Raymond's alma mater, naturally, and came home for holidays full of theories about market dynamics and personal optimization. She looked at our house, our life, our values with barely concealed contempt. "You could do more, Mama," she'd say, as if my contentment was a personal failing. "Daddy started with nothing and built an empire. You've had the same job for 20 years. Some things matter more than money," I'd reply, but she'd already stopped listening. The final explosion came during her senior year. Raymond had been working 100-hour weeks on some massive acquisition deal. I'd been handling everything at home, grocery shopping, laundry, the mundane tasks that kept life running. When he missed Monique's graduation because of a client crisis, I finally said what had been building for years. "This is enough, Raymond. Family has to come first sometimes." He stood in our kitchen, that crystal and granite shrine to success, still wearing his business suit at midnight, checking emails on his phone. "Don't you dare lecture me about priorities. Everything we have, everything Monique's accomplished, exists because of my work. What about everything we've lost?" "Like what?" He finally looked up from his phone, genuinely puzzled. "Like us. Like being a family instead of a corporation." He stared at me for a long moment, and I saw my answer in his eyes before he spoke. We weren't a family anymore. We were a business arrangement that had outlived its usefulness. "Maybe it's time we stopped pretending this is working," he said quietly. The divorce took 6 months. Raymond's lawyers were efficient, professional, devastating. I got the house on Magnolia Street, our old starter home that he'd kept as rental property, and enough money to live modestly. He got everything else, including Monique's unquestioned loyalty. "You're holding her back too," Monique told me during one of our last conversations before she moved to New York to work for Raymond's company. "All this guilt about family values and simple living. It's toxic, Mama. I can't be around that negativity anymore." I sat alone in my empty house afterward, surrounded by boxes of memories from a life that apparently meant nothing to the people I'd loved most. Now, 15 years later, the afternoon light was fading outside my apartment window. My coffee had grown cold. The ceramic shards still scattered on the floor. Somewhere across town, funeral preparations were underway for the man who'd once promised me forever, and I had no idea why he'd remembered my name in his will. The 3 days between James Morrison's call and the funeral passed in a strange, suspended state. I'd cleaned my apartment twice, pressed my one good dress, and rehearsed conversations that would never happen. Each morning I'd considered not going, but each evening found me still committed to paying my respects, whatever the cost. Friday morning arrived gray and humid, typical May weather in Georgia. I stood before my bathroom mirror, adjusting a necklace I hadn't worn in 5 years, wondering what Raymond would think of the woman I'd become. The reflection showed someone older than I felt inside, silver hair where black used to be, lines mapping the geography of quiet disappointments. The drive to Peaceful Rest Memorial Chapel took 20 minutes through neighborhoods that told the story of Atlanta's economic divide. My modest apartment complex gave way to middle-class subdivisions, then to the manicured lawns and stone facades where Raymond's circle lived. The chapel sat on a hill overlooking the city, its elegant architecture suggesting permanence and prosperity. Cars lined the circular drive, Mercedes sedans, BMW SUVs, a handful of Teslas that probably cost more than I'd made in my best year. I parked my 15-year-old Honda between a Lexus and a Cadillac, feeling like an intruder at someone else's celebration. The chapel's interior whispered money, mahogany pews, stained glass windows, flowers arranged with artistic precision. At least 200 people filled the space, their conversations creating a low hum of respectful mourning mixed with business networking. I recognized some faces from the business dinners Raymond had dragged me to during our married years, but most were strangers from the life he'd built after me. I slipped into a back pew, hoping to remain invisible until the service ended, but whispers followed my arrival like ripples in still water. A woman in an expensive black suit nudged her companion, pointing discreetly in my direction. I caught fragments of conversation. Her ex-wife. Can you believe she? After what she put him through. The stories had taken on their own life over the years. Apparently, in this version, I was the villain who'd held back a brilliant man, the anchor that had nearly drowned his ambitions. I'd learned long ago not to fight narratives that served other people's need for simple explanations. Mama. The voice cut through the chapel's murmur like a blade. I looked up to see Monique striding down the aisle, her face a mask of disbelief and barely controlled anger. At 37, she'd inherited Raymond's sharp features and commanding presence, dressed in a designer suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Success radiated from her like heat from pavement. Expensive watch, perfect hair, the confident posture of someone who'd never doubted her place in the world. What are you doing here? Her voice carried across the chapel, turning heads and silencing conversations. I stood slowly, meeting her gaze. I came to pay my respects. You lost the right to do that 15 years ago. She moved closer, close enough that I could smell her perfume, something sophisticated and aggressive. He wouldn't want you here. Maybe not. But I needed to be here. For what? To ease your conscience? To play the grieving widow for people who know exactly what kind of wife you were. The chapel had gone completely quiet now. 200 pairs of eyes focused on our confrontation like spectators at a sporting event. I felt the familiar weight of judgment, the same pressure that had suffocated me during those final years of our marriage. But this time, something was different. This time, I had nothing left to lose. I'm not here to cause trouble, Monique. I'll sit in the back. I won't speak to anyone. When the service ends, I'll leave. You'll leave now. Her voice rose another notch, drawing murmurs of approval from the crowd. You embarrassed him enough when he was alive. Don't compound it by pretending to grieve his death. I remained standing, holding her stare. Around us, the chapel buzzed with anticipation. Someone coughed. A cell phone vibrated against wood. Before I could respond, Monique turned to address the gathered mourners, her voice carrying the practiced authority of someone accustomed to commanding rooms. I apologize for this disruption during what should be a time of remembrance. She gestured toward me with the casual dismissal of someone swatting a fly. My mother seems to have forgotten that divorce means you're no longer family. A few people nodded. Someone whispered agreement. I felt heat rising in my cheeks but forced myself to remain calm. For those who don't know, Monique continued, warming to her theme, this is Shirley Coleman, the woman who spent 22 years holding back one of the most brilliant men this city has ever produced. While my father was building an empire that employed hundreds of people, she was content to punch a time clock and complain about his ambitions. Monique, that's enough. The words came out harder than I intended. Is it? Because I think these people deserve to understand why you're really here. She turned back to the crowd, a prosecutor addressing a jury. She took half his assets in the divorce despite contributing nothing to his success. Then she spent 15 years acting like the victim while he built something magnificent. The crowd was fully engaged now, a few heads nodding in agreement. I saw faces I recognized, former neighbors, people I'd considered friends during the marriage. None of them met my eyes. He supported her for years while she refused to grow, refused to take risks, refused to be the partner he deserved. And now that he's gone, she shows up expecting sympathy? Expecting to be treated like she mattered in his life. Each word landed like a physical blow, not because they were entirely untrue, but because they reduced 22 years of marriage to a simple story of failure and blame. I thought about defending myself, explaining the complexity of what we'd shared, the love that had existed alongside the growing incompatibility. But what was the point? These people had chosen their narrative long ago. My father died building something that will outlast all of us, Monique concluded, her voice rising with conviction. He deserved a wife who would have helped him reach those heights, not one who tried to drag him down to her level. The chapel fell silent. I stood there, fully exposed, feeling the weight of 200 judgmental stares. Part of me wanted to walk out, to spare myself the continued humiliation. But another part, the part that had loved Raymond Coleman more than anything else in the world, refused to be driven away from his final goodbye. "Are you finished?" I asked quietly. Monique's eyes flashed with surprise. She'd expected me to crumble, to slink away in shame. When I remained standing, her confidence flickered for just a moment. "I loved your father for 40 years, I said, my voice carrying clearly through the silent chapel. 22 of them as his wife, 18 more as someone who wished him well despite everything that went wrong between us. I'm not here to make claims or demand recognition. I'm here because once upon a time, we made promises to each other that mattered, and I choose to honor that memory." I sat back down, folding my hands in my lap. Around me, the silence stretched uncomfortably. Monique stood frozen in the aisle, apparently unprepared for resistance to her public trial. "The service will begin in 5 minutes, someone announced from the front of the chapel, the funeral director, probably, trying to restore order to his carefully orchestrated event. Monique shot me one final look of contempt before striding toward the front pew, reserved for family. As conversations gradually resumed, I caught fragments of continued gossip. Nerve of some people. Poor Monique, having to deal with this. Should have stayed home. But I stayed. Through the eulogy that painted Raymond as a visionary who'd overcome obstacles to achieve greatness. Through the readings from business associates who spoke of his leadership and innovation. Through the musical selections that emphasized triumph over adversity. When it ended, people filed past, offering condolences to Monique while pointedly ignoring me. I waited until the chapel had mostly emptied before standing to leave. Mrs. Coleman. A woman in an expensive suit approached, middle-aged, professional, carrying a leather briefcase. "Diane Morrison from Morrison and Associates. Could I have a word?" As the last hymn faded and the funeral director stepped forward with closing remarks, I felt the familiar weight of exhaustion settling over me like a heavy coat. The ordeal was nearly over. In a few minutes, I could slip out through the side door, drive home to my quiet apartment, and try to forget this entire humiliating experience. Around me, people were gathering their things. Purses, programs, the subtle restlessness that signals a formal event's end. Monique stood near the front, accepting condolences with the practiced grace of someone accustomed to being the center of attention. A few people glanced my way, but most had already dismissed me as irrelevant to the day's proceedings. I was reaching for my purse when a voice stopped me. "Mrs. Coleman." Diane Morrison approached with measured steps, her expensive suit impeccable despite the long ceremony. Up close, she looked younger than I'd expected. Maybe 50, with sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and the kind of confident bearing that came from years of handling wealthy clients' affairs. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said, extending her hand. "Diane Morrison, Morrison and Associates. We spoke briefly after the service." "Thank you." I shook her hand, noting the firm grip and direct gaze. The service was very nice. Raymond would have appreciated it. Indeed. He was quite specific about his final arrangements. She paused, glancing around the emptying chapel. "I wonder if I might have a word with you and Monique. There are some matters we need to discuss regarding Mr. Coleman's estate." Before I could respond, Monique appeared at my shoulder, her expression shifting from practiced grief to alert interest. "Diane, finally. I was wondering when we'd handle the business side of things." "Of course, Monique. These matters require careful attention." Diane's voice carried the measured tone of someone accustomed to delivering important news. "I'd like both of you to come to my office for the reading of your father's will." "Both of us?" Monique's eyebrows rose. "Is that necessary?" "I mean, she's not." She gestured vaguely in my direction. "Your mother is specifically named in the will, Monique. Her presence is required by law." I felt a flutter of surprise. Named in the will? That seemed unlikely, given everything that had passed between Raymond and me. More likely some minor formality, perhaps forgiving an old debt or confirming that I had no claim to his estate. I don't think that's necessary, I said quietly. I'm sure it's just a formality. You don't need me there. Diane's eyes met mine directly. I'm afraid I do, Mrs. Coleman. Mr. Coleman was very specific about who should be present for the reading. Both you and Monique must be there. Something in her tone suggested this wasn't negotiable. Monique looked annoyed but shrugged with the casual confidence of someone who knew she had nothing to worry about. Fine. Let's get this over with. She turned to me with barely concealed impatience. Try not to make this more difficult than it needs to be. The walk to Diane's office took us 3 blocks through downtown Atlanta, past buildings that had watched the city's fortunes rise and fall with various industries. Diane maintained professional small talk, comments about the weather, the turnout at the service, carefully neutral observations that revealed nothing about what awaited us. Her office occupied the top floor of a restored Victorian house, all dark wood and leather-bound books that spoke of established success. Certificates and diplomas lined the walls, interrupted by photographs of Diane with various local dignitaries and business leaders. It was exactly the kind of place Raymond would have chosen. Prestigious but not ostentatious, successful but respectful of tradition. Please, have a seat. Diane gestured toward 2 leather chairs positioned in front of her mahogany desk. Monique claimed the chair closest to Diane, leaving me the one slightly to the side, which felt appropriate, given my peripheral status in these proceedings. Diane settled behind her desk and opened a thick file folder, extracting several legal documents with the careful precision of someone who'd performed this ritual countless times. The afternoon light slanted through tall windows, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny spirits in the suddenly quiet room. Before we begin, Diane said, adjusting her glasses, I want to express my condolences again. Raymond was not only a valued client but someone I considered a friend. His loss is deeply felt by everyone who knew him. Monique nodded solemnly. I remained silent, unsure what response was expected from someone whose relationship with the deceased was so complicated. Diane lifted the top document, several pages bound with a blue backing, and cleared her throat. This is the last will and testament of Raymond Marcus Coleman, executed on March 15, 2024, and properly witnessed according to Georgia state law. This will supersedes all previous wills and codicils. Only 14 months ago. I wondered what had prompted Raymond to update his will so recently. Had he been sick? Had something happened that made him contemplate mortality? The will confirms that Mr. Coleman was of sound mind and disposing memory when these documents were prepared, and that he was under no undue influence or coercion. Diane's voice carried the formal cadence of legal proceedings, each word carefully enunciated. Monique leaned forward slightly, her hands clasped together. I could see the anticipation in her posture, a woman preparing to claim her inheritance, to finally step fully into the empire her father had built. Diane turned to the second page of the will, her reading glasses catching the afternoon light as she continued in her measured, professional tone. I hereby make the following specific bequests and devises, she read, her voice steady and clear. To my beloved daughter Monique Elaine Coleman, I leave the family home at 847 Oak Ridge Drive, along with all furnishings, artwork, and personal property contained therein. Monique smiled, a satisfied expression spreading across her face. The Oak Ridge house was worth at least $800,000, a substantial property with city views and enough space to entertain business associates properly. Additionally, Diane continued, I bequeath to Monique the sum of $500,000, to be transferred from my primary investment account within 60 days of probate. $500,000 plus the house. I watched Monique's reaction carefully, noting how her smile flickered slightly around the edges. She was pleased, certainly, but I could see her calculating in her head. $500,000 was significant money, but Raymond's business empire was worth far more than that. Where was the rest? Where was the company? That's wonderful, of course, Monique said, her voice carrying a note of uncertainty she was trying to mask. But what about Daddy's business interests? The company. Diane set down the first page and lifted the second, her expression remaining professionally neutral. I'm continuing with the specific bequests, Monique. Please allow me to finish reading the relevant sections. I shifted in my chair, feeling increasingly like an intruder witnessing a private family moment. $500,000 was more money than I'd seen in several lifetimes. Combined with the house, Monique was receiving an inheritance that would set her up comfortably for years. It seemed appropriate, natural even. She was Raymond's daughter, his chosen successor in life, the person he'd groomed to understand his world. The bequest to Monique, Diane continued, includes the following conditions. The inheritance is contingent upon her continued employment with Coleman Consulting Solutions for a minimum of 2 years following the date of this will's execution, or until such time as the company is sold or dissolved. Now Monique looked genuinely confused. Conditions? What kind of conditions? And what do you mean, until the company is sold? Who would sell it? I'm reading the will as written, Monique. These are your father's words, not mine. Tension I hadn't noticed before began to creep into the room. Monique's confident posture shifted slightly, her hands unclenching and reclenching in her lap. I found myself leaning forward despite my intention to remain detached from these proceedings. Let me understand this clearly, Monique said, her voice taking on an edge I recognized from our confrontation at the chapel. I get the house and $500,000, but there are strings attached? And you're talking about the company being sold? That doesn't make sense. Daddy would never sell the company. It was his life's work. Diane removed her glasses and cleaned them carefully, a gesture that seemed designed to give everyone a moment to process what they'd heard. When she replaced them, her gaze moved between Monique and me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Your father's will contains additional provisions that address the disposition of his remaining assets, she said quietly. The company, his investment portfolio, and several other significant holdings. Well, then let's hear them, Monique demanded, her patience clearly wearing thin. What are these other provisions? I watched this exchange with growing unease. Something about Diane's manner suggested that we were approaching territory none of us were prepared for. The careful way she was passing her words, the slightly apologetic tone creeping into her voice. It reminded me of the way doctors spoke when they had difficult news to deliver. Before I continue, Diane said, settling back in her chair, I want to emphasize that these documents represent Mr. Coleman's final, considered wishes. They were prepared after extensive discussion and consultation, and he was adamant about their contents. The room fell silent except for the tick of an antique clock on Diane's bookshelf. Monique stared at the lawyer with growing alarm, while I found myself wondering why Raymond had insisted I be present for what seemed like a straightforward family matter. Diane lifted the third page of the will, her eyes scanning the text briefly before looking up at both of us. However, she said, her voice carrying a weight that made my stomach tighten, there are additional provisions that fundamentally alter the distribution of Mr. Coleman's estate. Diane lifted her reading glasses and looked directly at me for the first time since we'd entered her office. Something in her expression made my stomach tighten, a mixture of sympathy and professional obligation that suggested I was about to hear something I wasn't prepared for. However, she continued, her voice taking on additional weight, the will contains provisions for the disposition of Mr. Coleman's remaining assets, which constitute the majority of his estate. Monique leaned forward even further, her hands gripping the armrests of her chair. Finally, let's hear about the company and the rest of his investments. Diane returned her attention to the document, clearing her throat with the deliberate pause of someone about to deliver life-changing news. To my former wife, Shirley Marie Coleman, she read, her words falling into the quiet office like stones into still water. I bequeath the sum of $33.5 million to be transferred from my primary investment accounts and securities portfolio. The words hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. I felt my mouth fall open, a physical reaction I couldn't control. $33.5 million. The number was so large it didn't seem real, didn't seem to apply to someone like me, sitting in a lawyer's office in Atlanta, Georgia. There must be some mistake, I managed to say, my voice sounding strange and distant. Did you say 33 million? 33.5 million, yes. Diane's tone remained professionally neutral, but I caught something in her eyes. Not surprise, but the careful observation of someone watching expected chaos unfold. Monique's face had gone completely white, then flushed red, as if her blood couldn't decide which direction to flow. What did you just say? Additionally, Diane continued reading, apparently determined to deliver the complete bombshell. I transfer to Shirley Coleman controlling interest in Coleman Consulting Solutions, including all subsidiary companies, real estate holdings, and business assets. This transfer includes 65% ownership of all corporate entities and appointment as chairman of the board of directors. I couldn't breathe. The room seemed to tilt sideways, as if the laws of physics had suddenly changed their minds about how the world should work. Controlling interest in Raymond's company, the empire I'd watched him build from nothing, the business that had eventually consumed our marriage, the source of wealth that had made me feel so inadequate. He was giving it all to me. This can't be right. My voice came out as barely a whisper. There has to be some error in the documentation. I assure you, Mrs. Coleman, there is no error. Diane removed her glasses again, cleaning them with methodical precision. These documents were prepared under Mr. Coleman's direct supervision. He reviewed every word multiple times and confirmed these were his exact wishes. Monique shot to her feet so abruptly her chair rolled backward and struck the wall. This is impossible. He couldn't. She turned to stare at me with an expression of pure disbelief mixed with something darker. What did you do? How did you manipulate him? I didn't do anything, I said weakly, still trying to process the impossibility of what I'd just heard. I haven't spoken to your father in 15 years. Lies. The word exploded from Monique like a gunshot. People don't just give away $33 million to their ex-wives for no reason. You must have gotten to him somehow, convinced him when he was sick, when he wasn't thinking clearly. Diane's voice cut through Monique's rising hysteria with professional authority. I can assure you that Mr. Coleman was of completely sound mind when he executed these documents. He underwent a thorough mental competency evaluation specifically to prevent any future challenges to the will's validity. I sat frozen in my chair, watching this scene unfold as if it were happening to someone else. The numbers Diane had read, $33.5 million, controlling interest in a multi-million-dollar company, belonged in a different universe than the one where I worried about grocery bills and car repairs. But why? I asked, the question emerging from some deep place of confusion and disbelief. Why would he do this? Diane gathered the will documents into a neat stack, her movements careful and deliberate. Mr. Coleman left specific instructions regarding that question, Mrs. Coleman. He asked me to share a personal message with you after reading these provisions. Monique's face contorted with rage and betrayal. A personal message? He left her a personal message but cut me out of everything that mattered. You received a substantial inheritance, Monique, Diane replied calmly. $500,000 and a valuable property represent more wealth than most people see in their lifetimes. Compared to what she's getting, Monique pointed at me with a shaking finger. You're talking about hundreds of millions in total assets. The company alone is worth more than everything else combined. The room pulsed with tension so thick I could taste it. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I realized that my entire life had just changed in ways I couldn't begin to comprehend. But all I could focus on was the impossible fact that Raymond, stubborn, ambitious Raymond, who had grown to resent everything I represented, had somehow decided to give me everything he'd built. That's when Monique completely lost control. This is fraud, she screamed, her voice cracking with rage. Criminal fraud. He was manipulated, coerced, mentally compromised. She whirled toward me, her face twisted with fury and disbelief. You did something to him. There's no other explanation. I shrank back in my chair, overwhelmed by the violence of her reaction. Monique, I swear to you, I had no contact with your father. I didn't even know he was sick. Liar. She slammed her palm against Diane's desk, sending papers scattering. Nobody gives away everything they've built to someone who abandoned their family. Someone who couldn't even be bothered to call when he was dying. I didn't abandon anyone, I said quietly, finding some small reserve of strength. Our marriage ended, but that doesn't mean. It means exactly that. Monique's voice rose to a near shriek. You walked away from us. You took your pathetic settlement and disappeared into your pathetic little life while he built an empire. And now you want me to believe he just decided to hand it all over to you. Diane's voice cut through the chaos with professional authority. Ms. Coleman, Monique, I understand this is difficult news, but I must insist you control yourself. These are your father's clearly stated wishes, executed with full legal authority. Monique spun toward the lawyer, her eyes blazing. I want every document examined. I want psychiatric evaluations. I want to know every single contact this woman had with my father in the past 5 years. There were no contacts, Diane replied calmly. Mr. Coleman made that very clear when he explained his decision. Explained his decision? Monique's laugh was bitter and sharp. So he did explain why he decided to betray his only daughter and give everything to the woman who ruined his first marriage? He left a personal message for your mother, yes. The word mother seemed to hit Monique like a physical blow. For just a moment, her rage flickered, and something else showed through, a pain so deep it made my chest ache. Then the fury returned, doubled in intensity. She's not my mother, Monique snarled. My mother would have been there when he needed her. My mother would have supported his dreams instead of trying to drag him down. She turned back to me, her face contorted with years of accumulated resentment. You're nothing but a failed woman who couldn't handle being married to someone better than you. Each word landed like a knife thrust, not because they were entirely false, but because they contained enough truth to draw blood. I had felt inadequate during those final years. I had struggled with Raymond's success. I had been the one who couldn't adapt to the world he was creating. Maybe you're right, I said quietly. Maybe I wasn't the wife he deserved. But I never asked for this. I never expected this. Expected. Monique's voice climbed another octave. You orchestrated this. Somehow, someway you got to him when he was vulnerable, when he was sick or scared or... That's enough, Diane interrupted, her professional patience finally showing strain. Mr. Coleman was neither sick nor vulnerable when he made these decisions. He was, in fact, more determined and clear-minded than I'd ever seen him. Then why? Monique demanded, her voice breaking slightly. Why would he do this to me? I was everything he wanted me to be. I worked for his company. I lived the life he planned for me. I became the daughter he could be proud of. The pain in her voice cut through my own shock. Despite everything, the years of hostility, the public humiliation, the bitter accusations, I saw her clearly for a moment, a woman who had spent her entire adult life trying to earn her father's approval, only to discover he'd given his ultimate validation to someone else. He left a message explaining his reasoning, Diane said gently. Would you like me to read it? Monique's hands were shaking now, her whole body vibrating with suppressed rage and grief. A message. He couldn't explain it to my face, but he left a message for her. The message addresses both of you, actually. It was meant to be shared after the will reading. I found my voice, though it came out hoarse and uncertain. Maybe we should hear what he had to say. Monique's eyes locked on mine with pure hatred. You have no right to make decisions here. You have no right to any of this. But even as she spoke, I could see the desperate need in her expression, the need to understand why her father had chosen to shatter everything she believed about her place in his world. Diane was already reaching for another envelope, one with personal message written across it in Raymond's familiar handwriting. Diane raised her hand, commanding silence with the authority of someone accustomed to controlling emotional courtrooms. Enough, both of you. Her voice cut through the tension like a blade. Before this goes any further, I have something that will explain everything. She opened the manila envelope with Raymond's distinctive handwriting across the front, extracting several pages of cream-colored stationery. Raymond knew this moment would be difficult. He asked me to read this personal message after the will was announced. Monique slumped back into her chair, her rage momentarily displaced by desperate curiosity. I remained frozen, afraid to hope for understanding but desperate for any explanation that might make sense of this impossible situation. Diane cleared her throat and began reading, in Raymond's own words. My dearest Shirley, if you're hearing this, it means I'm gone, and you're probably sitting in Diane's office wondering if the entire world has lost its mind. I can picture your face, that expression you used to get when I'd rearranged the living room furniture without warning. Confused, but trying to be polite about it. Despite everything, I felt my lips curve into the ghost of a smile. He'd captured that expression perfectly, and somehow, hearing his voice through Diane's reading made him feel present in the room. I know this inheritance comes as a shock. I know you're probably thinking there's been some terrible mistake, that you don't deserve this money or this responsibility. But Shirley, you're wrong. You deserve every penny, and I'm going to tell you why. Diane paused, glancing up at both of us before continuing. I never stopped loving you. Not during our worst fights. Not during the divorce proceedings. Not during these 15 years of stubborn silence. I was angry with you for not understanding my ambitions. But I was angrier with myself for choosing those ambitions over our marriage. You tried to save us, Shirley. You begged me to find balance, to remember what mattered. I was too proud, and too afraid to listen. The words hit me like physical blows. I felt tears starting, hot and unexpected, as decades of guilt and regret crystallized into this moment of impossible absolution. Monique, the message continued, and I saw my daughter's head snap up at hearing her name. My beautiful, brilliant girl. I know you're furious right now. Probably convinced your mother somehow manipulated me. But sweetheart, you're not ready for this inheritance. Not yet. Monique's face went white, then red, cycling through emotions too quickly to track. You've lived your entire adult life in the shadow of my success, accepting the benefits without understanding the responsibility. You've never had to build something from nothing, never had to make the hard choices that wealth requires. More importantly, you've spent 15 years hating a good woman for crimes she never committed. That's not true, Monique whispered, but her voice lacked conviction. Diane continued reading. Shirley taught me about character, about integrity, about the kind of strength that doesn't need to prove itself through cruelty or judgment. I forgot those lessons when I chose money over marriage, business over love. But I never forgot the woman who taught them to me. I was crying openly now, not caring how it looked. Raymond's words were rebuilding something inside me that I thought was permanently broken. The sense that I had value, that my quiet life of dignity and service meant something. Monique, you have received enough to live comfortably and explore who you might become without the weight of unlimited wealth. Learn to build something yourself. Learn to value people over profit. Learn to forgive your mother for the crime of being human and imperfect. Monique made a sound like a wounded animal, but whether from rage or pain, I couldn't tell. Shirley, you're inheriting more than money. You're inheriting the chance to do what I should have done, to use wealth as a tool for good rather than a weapon for proving superiority. I trust you because you never wanted this, because you'll never use it to hurt people the way I sometimes did. The message continued for several more paragraphs, outlining practical arrangements and expressing hopes for both our futures. But the core message was clear. Raymond had chosen love over entitlement, character over expectation, wisdom over wealth. When Diane finished reading, the office fell into profound silence. I sat with tears on my cheeks, overwhelmed by the gift of knowing that Raymond had loved me until the end. Monique stared at the floor, her entire worldview crumbling around her. Finally, Diane folded the letter carefully and placed it back in its envelope. He asked me to give this to you, Shirley. The original is yours to keep. I reached for the letter with trembling hands, holding the last conversation I would ever have with the man who had shaped my life in ways both beautiful and painful. The weight of Raymond's words settled over the office like dust after an explosion. For several minutes, none of us spoke. I held his letter against my chest, feeling the physical reality of his final gift. Not just the money, but the restoration of my worth in his eyes and, more importantly, in my own. Monique was the first to break the silence. "This isn't over," she said quietly, but the fire had gone out of her voice. "I can contest this. Mental incapacity, undue influence, fraud. There are ways to challenge a will." I looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time since we'd entered Diane's office. I saw a woman who had spent her entire life expecting the world to bend to her wishes, who had never learned that love couldn't be inherited or demanded, only earned. "You could try," I said gently. "But your father was right, Monique. You're not ready for this responsibility. And you are." Her laugh was bitter, hollow. "You're a nobody, Mama, a retired hospital worker with no business experience, no connections, no understanding of what it takes to run a company worth hundreds of millions." For a moment, the old Shirley, the one who had felt inadequate for 22 years, wanted to agree with her. But Raymond's words echoed in my mind. "You deserve every penny." "Maybe you're right," I said, standing up slowly. "Maybe I don't know anything about running a business empire. But I know something your father valued more than business expertise." "What's that?" "I know the difference between serving others and serving myself." Monique's face twisted with a final flash of rage. "This is insane. He was sick. He was old. He wasn't thinking clearly." Diane's voice cut through the outburst with professional finality. "Your father was 62 years old and in perfect mental health when he executed these documents. He underwent extensive psychological evaluation specifically to prevent the kind of challenges you're threatening." "Then why?" Monique's voice cracked like a teenager's. "Why would he do this to me?" I felt a surge of unexpected compassion for this angry woman who was, despite everything, still my daughter. "He didn't do it to you, Monique. He did it for you. He gave you a chance to discover who you are when you're not living in the shadow of unlimited wealth." "I don't want that chance." The words exploded from her with the force of 15 years of entitlement and expectation. "I want what's rightfully mine." "What's rightfully yours," I said quietly, "is $500,000 and a house worth nearly $1 million. That's more than most people see in a lifetime. What you think you deserved was never really yours to begin with." Monique stared at me for a long moment, and I saw her realize that something fundamental had changed. The woman she'd publicly humiliated that morning, the mother she'd dismissed as a failure, was no longer asking for her approval or understanding. "You think you've won," she said, gathering her purse with shaking hands. "You think this makes you some kind of hero?" "No," I replied, and I felt the truth of it in my bones. "I think it makes me responsible." She stood at the office door for a moment, seeming smaller than when she'd entered. "This isn't finished." "Yes, it is," I said gently. "This finished the moment your father made his choice. The only question now is what you do with the life he's given you." She left without another word, the door closing behind her with a soft click that seemed to echo in the sudden quiet. Diane began organizing papers on her desk, the rustle of documents returning us to practical reality. "There will be paperwork to complete, accounts to transfer, board meetings to schedule. The company's current management team is excellent. They can help you transition into your new role." I nodded, still processing the magnitude of what had happened. "Diane, can I ask you something?" "Of course. Did he really love me, even after everything that went wrong between us?" She smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from her all day. "Shirley, he talked about you every time we met. Not about the divorce, not about the problems. About the woman who taught him that success without character is just expensive failure." I walked out of that office a different woman than the one who had entered. The afternoon sun felt warmer, the air cleaner. I had work to do, responsibilities to embrace, a company to learn about and improve. But for the first time in 15 years, I felt worthy of the challenge. Justice, I realized, wasn't about revenge or vindication. It was about recognition, the recognition that character matters more than credentials, that patience outlasts entitlement, and that love, real love, never truly dies. Raymond had seen all of that. And in his final act, he had given me the chance to prove him right. If you liked this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left. Thank you for watching.